Fabián, por favor, cuando quieras.
Bueno, muchas gracias. También quisiera agradecer la invitación de Claudio, a Rodrigo y a las autoridades de la academia. Es mi segunda vez aquí, me siento muy honrado y contento de poder ir un poco con ustedes. No sé si se escucha bien, porque recién tengo la impresión de que el ruido del aire acondicionado y eso perturbaba un poquito allá atrás el sonido. Ustedes me dicen, por favor, si en algún momento esto no se escucha muy bien, sobre todo porque voy a leer en una lengua que no es la mía y entonces puede ser peor, aunque uno nunca sabe cuánto maneja de la propia. Em, eh, pido disculpas por leer en inglés en cierto sentido, porque bueno, esto lo tengo armado en inglés y es muy laborioso a veces ponerlo en castellano. Este, y hace ya un tiempo que estoy trabajando sobre eso. Las traducciones que ustedes tienen en el handout y que quizás van apareciendo allí, voy a hacer referencia a algunas de ellas. Este, son varios textos de Lambda 6, Lambda 7 y Lambda 9, que es un pasaje, es un capítulo muy breve, pero discutido, digamos así. Y básicamente tienen la función de que ustedes las consideren cuando y cómo lo crean necesario, mejor y oportuno. Por ejemplo, para hacer objeciones. Yo tengo unas 4.000 palabras más o menos. Soy muy malo para calcular estas cosas, pero voy a tratar de que no usar, por ejemplo, el tiempo que Jorge no usa. ¿No es cierto? Sería demasiado eso, no es el sentido. Básicamente lo que voy a hacer, le pido disculpas por hablar en castellano y luego en inglés, ambas cosas un poquito mal, pero espero que poder hacerlo de la mejor manera. Em, es una cierta intención de considerar a Lambda 9 como un capítulo en el cual Aristóteles sostiene una posición compatible con lo que presenta sobre el sentido eh, del nous como energía y el nous como primer motor o como motor en lambda 7 y 6 respectivamente. Eso va a aparecer como en el trasfondo de mi presentación, ese es mi interés final, pero básicamente voy a tratar de concentrarme un poquito en una parte de lambda 9, no hasta que aparece la noesis noeseos. Luego vienen tres aproximadamente dificultades más a las cuales ahora no voy a poder prestar atención. Son bastante oscuras ellas mismas de por sí. Bueno, comienzo. Quizás podemos simplemente leer y luego ya paso al inglés. The beginning of Lambda 9 is about questions, or raises questions, Aristotle about um, probably the divine intellect. And he says that, este es el texto cero, no sé si ustedes lo muestran o alguien lo muestra, Rodrigo, eso, perdón. Pero si no, no es ninguna cosa indispensable para que nadie se inquiete, ¿sí? Lo leo, y lo leo en inglés. En la traducción siempre que sigo es la de Lindsay Johnson, ¿sí? But questions relating to its intellect present certain difficulties. For while it seems to be the most divine of the phenomena, the question in what condition it would be to be such a thing presents certain problems. So let me start with a problem about Aristotle's theory of the divine nous in Lambda 9. Just a presentation regarding questions before in Lambda 7 and 6 and 7. Aristotle claims in Metaphysics Lambda 6.9 that first, there is a first mover, and that it is an unmoved substance and an intellect, which in a way is the same as the intelligible, and that it is active or just active thinking, meaning that it is not the exercise of a capacity or the actualization of a potentiality. For reasons that Aristotle makes explicit in Lambda 9, the intellect of the first unmoved mover, I call it Fume, or first unmoved mover, is in no way, its intellect is in no way a potentiality, dynamis, on pain of not being the best substance. In a climax of lambda 9, which is 74b 3335, the active feature of the fume's intellect seems to be explained by a peculiar reflexive character of its thinking, which turns out to be thinking of thinking, and so the same as its object of thought. In this last regard, and in spite of other relevant differences, the fume's intellect exhibits some similarities with the human intellect, which we have presented mainly in the Anima 3-4. Consider what happens when the human intellect is assimilated to its objects or become like them, as in who knows in actuality is said to do so. In this claim, which is a quotation of 429b67 of the Anima, Aristotle has in mind the result of learning. By grasping its object by itself, the human intellect is in a state of actualization as the person who has learned has actualized a potentiality. But still, at this end point of the process, the intellect is in potentiality in a way, tote dyname, writes Aristotle in that passage, probably because it is essentially a power to think. So Aristotle takes that the human intellect is a potentiality or capacity to think, which becomes activated by an agent, i.e. the thinkable. This shows structural similarities to what happens with perception. Also in perception, the perceiver is acted upon by a sensible quality, which is a mover and prior in being to the perceiver. In a sense, both are the same and one, the perceiver and the perceived object. More precisely, when the object of knowledge is grasped. This can explain that by having grasped its object of thought, the human intellect thinks itself, as it is in 429b19 of b910 of the Anima, since the human intellect thinks something else which the intellect has fully grasped in a sense, or assimilated. But in another sense, the object of knowledge is prior to the knower and remains so. But the object of knowledge is, as a mover, actual and does not depend on the knower. It is prior, naturally prior to it. It is also active, in that it is the mover that brings about the knowledge process. So the contrast between the mover and the moved thing is valid for the human finite intellect. However, it is not possible for the intellect of the person mover, the divine intellect, let's suppose, to be precisely so, if it is true that it is unmoved and essentially active. Digo un par de cositas en castellano. Ahí traté de presentar un sketch, ¿no es cierto?, de aspectos similares y disimilares del intelecto finito y el intelecto humano, el intelecto finito y el intelecto divino, que me van a servir de trasfondo para la discusión. Let me come back to metaphysics lambda. Besides many peculiar problems with the claims and the arguments in lambda 6, 7, and 9, a common view on these chapters, which I will oppose here, states that the conception of nous, intellect or thought, in lambda 9 disregards the activity feature, energia, which on the contrary is prominent in lambda 6, 7. As with any other ordinary intellect, so the suggestion goes, the fume's intellect, the intellect of the person, mover, could be a capacity, a dynamis, that is acted upon and so no longer a substance whose essence is activity. With this, the causal role of the fume's intellect regarding the first heaven be that an efficient or a final cause, which is set to move in the way in which the desirable and the intelligible move, which probably means, in my understanding of the comparison, that it moves without being moved, and that it moves the first given by being loved, etc. So all these active features which make the unmoved mover in a real mover seems to be ignored or overlooked in the theory of the intellect in lambda 9. This is so because in Aristotle's eyes, for being a first mover, the divine intellect must be essentially active. But clearly, lambda 9's intellect cannot be a first unmoved mover if it is a regular capacity that is acted upon something else, which implies to be set in motion, and nothing can be an essentially active substance if it contains some potentiality, i.e., the dynamis that makes it an intellect. There's a main problem about the relationship between lambda 6, 7, and 9, which were often thought to be incompatible or explainable as doublets, of which lambda 9 has been considered to be an older version working with a more rudimentary model of nous, or has been confined to play the role of an appendix to lambda 7. So the problems between these pair of chapters revolves around explaining how the prime mover's peculiar causality and its nature as the first unmoved mover can be related to its being an intellect. In other words, why does Aristotle think that a substance that is essentially a thinking can play the role of a first mover of the heaven? This is the main issue I aim to address here by considering the argument of lambda 9 and some related passages of lambda 6, 7, which I will not do here. On the main point of controversy, I will argue that the intellect of lambda 9 can fulfill the role of the universal mover, since it is an essentially active substance whose nature is just thinking. So my thesis will be that if we make clear that the first unmoved mover's intellect does not involve potentiality, and that it is essentially active thinking, and because of this, thinking of thinking, we will be in a position to better understand the prime mover's specific causality as the object of thought and desire, as claimed in lambda 7, and so to be clear about the relationship between lambda 9 and 7. More precisely, I contend that lambda 9 elaborates mainly on the actuality or activity feature granted to the prime mover in lambda 6, and discuss for the divine intellect the more general thesis of lambda 7 that the intellect thinks itself. Okay, let me go now into some detail. Let's pay attention to some difficulties presented at the beginning, right at the beginning or from the outset in lambda 9. Let me start considering lambda 9 by briefly paying attention to its argument. Quizás, estamos viendo nada de eso, no importa. Podemos ver en tal caso en el handout los textos de lambda 9 y comienzo, si ustedes quieren ir mirándolos, que son creo que T5, claro, ya en T5 entro en lambda 9. Let me start also considering lambda 9 by briefly paying attention to its argument. Commentators usually see the chapter divided in two main difficulties. I skip the lines, etc. Which are raised, these two difficulties, after a short presentation, the text I have read at the beginning, of the intellect divinity. T5 si puede ser. Voy cantando, sí. Following this, so according to this suggestion, Eso debería ser como en página 7, Rodrigo. Following this division, which is perfectly acceptable of the text, Aristotle presents his responses to the two first difficulties uh, right after this. Then a second response is crowned by the most important conclusion at 74b 3335, which is the noesis noesis. Then some supplementary difficulties, which I mentioned when I started my presentation, are considered, which have to do with goodness. How is or how does the fume share in goodness, which is also related to the next chapter, which deals with the question about how is goodness present in the nature of the whole, so in the universe. Let's go to the first two difficulties. The first two difficulties revolve around the explanation of the superiority, so here aristeusia and the like, of the intellect. It is important, namely, to fix where Aristotle writes intellect, nous, and noesis, because that's a source of controversy, isn't it? This intellect is not just the most divine among the things that are, but as the general reading of the chapter makes it plausible, as I believe, it also is the divine intellect, although it is not stated clearly. Even so, one cannot exclude that what is said here about such an intellect covers the intellects of the stars that are attached to the spheres as they were considered in the chapter before, in Lambda 8. Anyway, what is said in Lambda 9 must be valid for every divine intellect, perhaps as a primus inter pares, and so for the fume primarily. The first difficulty, which is D1, that I didn't take this D1, 2, etc. in the handout. The first difficulty, number D1, starts by establishing a condition. That's the following one. To be the most divine of the things, the intellect must think and think something. Otherwise, it will be like a potentiality, namely something merely having the capacity to think, but not exercising it due to laying dormant, to sleeping. Thinking nothing is like not thinking in this context. This is the best. This is the first option to consider to answer the difficulty or to deal with the difficulty. However, the intellect cannot think something different either. That's the second, since in that case, the intelligible object could be better than the thinking intellect. And this is the second option. So we have here, I think, what you already have in the screen. And I read it, part of it. For it, if it thinks nothing, why would it be the object of reverence? I think it's some non there. Its condition would be like that of one who sleeps. Or if it thinks that something else is what determines this, then since it is not this which is its substance, namely thinking, but rather potentiality, it could not be, the best substance. The first option states that if it thinks nothing, it will not be venerable. The translation renders eite garmeden noe. Having nothing to think is like not thinking, I submitted. One way of this is to remain as a mere capacity to think, which is never exercised. This should be clear with or by the Dodman comparison. The second option is that to put this capacity in exercise, the intellect must be affected by something different, acting upon it as regularly in the case of any human finite intellect and perception. This gives, in principle, a satisfactory symmetry to the antithesis as Brunswick has showed. So Aristotle presents a problem for this second option in 1074b 1921, which must be still in the text in D1. This difficulty deserves a careful consideration. If the intellect depends on something else to think, it will not be the most valuable thing. Here, dia gartuno ein totimion auto hyparchei at 7420 B 2021 makes it explicit that the valuable aspect of the intellect is just to think, to know, namely noein, which seems to presuppose that it is essentially active thinking, as confirmed by the contrast to the mere capacity of thinking. I render by active thinking the Greek noesis in this case, while dynamis is rendered regularly as potentiality, capacity, faculty, or even power. On the other hand, the problem for the first most implausible option is quite evident and thus barely mentioned, for nothing in a perpetually inactive state would qualify as venerable, and it probably would hardly count as intellect, since it will never exercise its proper capacity, thus contradicting the value that has been assumed for the intellect from the outset. In some T1 in our text, Aristotle seems to assume that thinking is essentially active. This feature is conveyed by the verbal activity known noesis at 74b20, which amounts to the same as the infinitive to noein, or to noein in the next line. This indicates that the active feature of thinking accounts for the superiority of the divine intellect. This is contrasted to the capacity or potentiality to think, which depends on something different that we may assume activates the capacity and is in this regard prior and superior. So the alternative in 74b1920, which is the result of admitting that something else determines or has some power, priority over the thinking, over the capacity to think, is that the substance of such an intellect, faculty, will not be thinking. The substance, the thinking will not be, the faculty, the nous will not be essentially thinking, but rather a mere potentiality, a dynamis activated by something else. This interpretation matches better with a text reading that takes tutu the allocurion at 74b19 in the prothesis, as given in Judson's translation, and justified also by some commentators. So the idea is that 74b19 introduces a required specification about the intellect by the adversative te. So the sentence states that the substance of the intellect cannot be a mere potentiality. In any reading of the line, however, Aristotle seems to mean here that this intellect is not governed by something else, since this could contradict its superiority, its purported superiority. While addressing the second difficulty, and I move now to D2, which must be T6, Rodrigo. Qué pena que Rodrigo tenga que estar afuera, ¿no es cierto? No, no. La verdad que quizás no vale la pena. While addressing the second difficulty, Aristotle intentionally remains neutral towards the question raised about the second option in D1, since he leaves momentarily open, for dialectical reasons I mean, whether the intellect substance is either a mere potential faculty or rather active thinking. T6, or part of it is, the main part is further whether intellect, and I quote, further whether intellect is its substance or thinking is intellect or thinking, so nous or noesis, what does it think? That's a central question. What is the object? What does it think? What does this thing thing, this thing. So yet with this impasse, he does not necessarily draw back from what may be read, at least as a suggestion in favor of the active thinking, as I have tried to show before. It could not be so if it is a mere potential faculty, since it is in virtue of thinking that the value belongs to the intellect. This point emerges as a condition to be considered as the best substance. But clearly, since this only states that the value depends on thinking, it is not enough to tip the balance in favor of the thinking as the substance of the intellect, since also a potential intellect can think. In leaving these options momentarily open, Aristotle seems just to meet a dialectical requirement to raise a further difficulty. Since it is assumed that the intellect actively thinks, the next question raised in D2 is, what does it think? P, no A. Again, the options at 74B 2227, which is in our D2, the options consider therefore an intellect which is supposed to think are that its object is either just itself, hauton, with a reflexive pronoun, or something different, heteron T. The alternative considered in D2 examines the second of these options. This may strike us as odd in the context, since Aristotle has already suggested that to keep up its superiority, the active intellect should not depend on something else. However, he may take advantage, that's my guess here, from this discussion to outline some central features that the object of the divine intellect must have or fulfill, regardless of whether the object of the intellect turns out to be something different. So D2 is delivered to show some problems for a change in intellect that moves from potentiality to actuality and so grasps different objects, as expressed in terms like dianoeistai, metabole, and kinesis in these passages. In the series of options presented in 74B 2327, which must still be in our D2 text, it is implied that to avoid a change in intellect, its object must fulfill some conditions. It must be always the same, the good, and since this object is grasped by the best substance, the divine intellect, let's suppose, it must also be the most divine and valuable thing. Furthermore, it must be changeless, for if a perfect being changes, it does it necessarily for the worse, says Aristotle. All this fosters the idea of the absolute simplicity both of the divine intellect and its object. We may note that if this last option is maintained in Aristotle's solution, the immobility feature of the divine intellect can match quite well with the immobility claimed for the prime mover in lambda 7. That's by the way, or a byproduct suggestion in which I would like to substantiate in a paper. Let me now consider. Leído 20 minutos ya, Claudia, ¿cierto? ¿Sí? ¿O un poco más todavía? Ok, sí, yo pienso que sí, en menos de 10. Ok, hemos presentado las dos dificultades, ¿no es cierto? ¿Es un nous o es una noesis? La pregunta acerca de qué piensa parece ser respondida en términos de no puede pensar algo que no sea perfecto y otras características asociadas. Déjenme entonces que yo vaya a... em, esos contienen ya sugerencias que podríamos tomar como las respuestas de Aristóteles, ¿no es cierto? Todas respuestas desarrolladas en argumentaciones por el absurdo, que son características, por otro lado, en un texto característicamente estenográfico, como se dice. Let me now briefly consider the main conclusion, and I go now to T8. That's the much expected noesis noesios. The main conclusion of the chapter is probably in the middle of it. And it is stated as follows, and I read, itself, therefore, is what it thinks, seeing that it is the greatest thing, and its thinking is thinking of thinking. If this follows indeed from the two responses given before, then we must explain how these three claims hold together. And the three claims are the following ones. First, the reflexive character of the intellect, i.e. the fact that the intellect thinks itself, should be qualified since it is a function of the previous two claims, namely, that's claim 2, that the substance of the intellect is active thinking, which means that it is not a faculty that is acted upon by something else. And that's claim 3, that by being a divine intellect and the best, it grasps the best only. So since the best substance is active thinking and it thinks the best, it thinks itself. I contend, and I will be now very brief, I contend that thinking of thinking, that's main contention of mine, explains the claim about the self-thinking character of the divine intellect, which in turn is a result of the divine intellect being essentially active thinking. The progression in this suggestion, the argumentative progression is this. By being essentially active, the divine intellect is strictly the same with its object. And so, the self of the intellect is determined by being identical with with what it has always grasped. Therefore, it thinks itself. This is obtained from the previous responses to the difficulties. Namely, in its being a pure exercise of thinking, which is its very substance, the divine intellect has always thought something on pain of not thinking, which is not different from itself. Thus, an essentially active intellect, or noesis, if you want, thinks itself, which is a function of its being maximally assimilated, maximally the same to its or as its peculiar object of intellection, which cannot be different from it. Ok, yo pienso que es mejor que yo cierre aquí en este momento y en tal caso dejar espacio a preguntas. Quizás digo en dos palabras ahora en castellano lo que en esta última parte he querido hacer. Yo me inclino a interpretar el carácter reflexivo que aparece como respuesta a la pregunta Tinoei, el divine intellect, ¿no es cierto? Se piensa Hautón, se piensa a sí mismo. Una reformulación de eso sería noesis noesios. Yo entiendo eso en un sentido de genitivo objetivo, no en el sentido de genitivo objetivo como si fuera el pensamiento que realiza un determinado sujeto, el divine intellect. Eso no me parece que esté para nada en cuestión. Pero entonces, adoptando la lectura tradicional que toma allí el genitivo objetivo, mi intención es dar una explicación del carácter reflexivo derivada. Es decir, el carácter reflexivo del pensamiento divino es derivada en la medida en que es aquella clase de pensamiento que por el hecho de ser el pensamiento esencialmente activo, essentially active thinking, como dije, ¿no es cierto? Ha siempre asimilado o es siempre de la manera máxima posible para un intelecto lo que piensa. Entonces, de esa manera, derivada, de esa manera como resultado, ¿no es cierto?, de ser máximamente idéntico a lo que piensa, es que creo que hay que explicar el carácter reflexivo y no tomar el carácter reflexivo como como, como se dice, ¿no es cierto?, como un lecho último de explicación, como un primario explicativo. Creo además que el carácter reflexivo vacía de alguna manera en este contexto, a pesar de lecturas hegelianas eh, que siempre han inspirado este texto, ¿no es cierto? Vacía de contenido al pensamiento divino en la medida en que no termina respondiendo a la pregunta crucial, ¿no es cierto? Que es, ¿cuál puede ser el objeto del pensamiento que justifique que ese pensamiento sea divino? En fin, eso creo que sería todo. Gracias y disculpas la...
Bueno, para una pregunta, ¿nadie quiera? Sí, a ver.
Sí, sí. 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 Sí.
No nos sale la grabación.
Ah, no, ok, entiendo, perfecto, no te preocupes.
Eh, entonces, eh, no recuerdo exactamente cuál fue tu respuesta ahí,
Sí.
pero me parece que una posibilidad es que aquí en T6 aparece una interpretación que quizá, una interpretación de que el objeto del pensamiento sea un heteron-T, algo distinto, otra cosa,
Sí.
que no había aparecido en T5, y es que em, el objeto del pensamiento divino sea otra cosa, pero siempre la misma.
Sí.
¿Sí?
Sí. Exacto.
Em, y esa posibilidad, que es bien desconcertante,
Sí.
no me queda claro. O sea, tengo dos dudas ahí. No sé si
Mm.
te parece que eso podría explicar por qué vuelve a esa pata del dilema,
Sí.
primero.
Sí.
Y la segunda pregunta sería, eh, ¿qué parte de la argumentación aristotélica descarta si se quiere, interpretación más específica de esa pata del dilema?
El que sea un heteron T. El que sea un hetero.
Que sea un heteron T, pero tu auto a él, siempre es lo mismo,
Claro.
¿no?
Sí. Bueno, muchas gracias, Javier. La verdad es buena pregunta porque detallada y a su vez permite hacer tener en el trasfondo el contexto general de discusión. Yo no he encontrado una mejor respuesta a eso y entonces me he volcado por la siguiente, que modestia aparte es de mi autoría, que no es gran cosa, claro, por supuesto, como en general las cosas de mi autoría. Y es que aquí hace Aristóteles un impas dialéctico. Entonces él dice lo siguiente, a ver, él sugirió, ¿no es cierto?, que no puede ser de otra cosa porque en la primera dificultad, porque si fuera de otra cosa, esa otra cosa debería tener cierta anterioridad, debería ser algo, por tanto, superior. Y entonces, claro, el esquema ese que va bien para el pensamiento humano, claro, el pensamiento humano aprende algo que es distinto, eso lo pone en movimiento, eso es paralelo a la percepción y eso tiene una cierta prioridad que Aristóteles llama prioridad natural en distintos textos de las categorías, al final de Gama 5. Bueno, eso no puede aplicar aquí. Pero él no lo desarrolla eso. Entonces yo creo que él ahí hace un impas dialéctico sin echar por tierra, sin dejar de lado lo anterior. Pero el impas dialéctico le sirve a él para lo siguiente. Eso es la razón por la cual yo me inclino a pensar que hay un impas dialéctico aquí. Él dice, bueno, ¿y qué tal si es un heterontí? Porque en el fondo lo que tenemos que hacer en la dialéctica es examinar las dos opciones, ¿no es cierto? Si es un heterontí, debería tener estas características, debería ser algo que sea no al acaso, sino que debería ser, como dice, tocalón et tijón. Al acaso no puede ser, ¿no es cierto? Tiene que ser algo que sea propio de él. Igualmente no puede ser algo que cambie. ¿Qué otra cosa dice allí? Las características que aparecen en la línea 25-26 de 1074b son también importantes. Debe ser... en realidad ahí aparece, bueno, si es lo más divino, si es lo más valioso, eh, ahí son objetos directos, ¿no es cierto? Si piensa lo más divino, lo más valioso, esos son objetos de su pensamiento. Otra vez podríamos pensar que es parte de lo que él quiere luego recoger cuando eche atrás, cuando descarte la posibilidad de que sea un heterontí. Entonces yo creo, bueno, si es así, no debería cambiar, porque si cambia, yo creo que ahí cuando sí cambia, empieza a decir, el sujeto del pensamiento no puede hacer más que cambiar para algo, en la medida en que sea algo perfecto, para peor, ¿no es cierto? Entonces yo lo que creo que el impas dialéctico le sirve a Aristóteles allí para decir, bueno, no inspecciona el primer cuerno del dilema, si es lo mismo, si piensa lo mismo, y lo deja para lo que es en el fondo la conclusión, tal vez la noesis noesios, eso es lo que yo creo. Pero en el fondo va a ocuparse de las características que va a tener, que va a deber tener el objeto del pensamiento divino, y van a ser características que están emparentadas con lo que dice en esta parte, en donde considera, bueno, ¿y qué tal si fuera algo diferente? Bueno, si fuera algo diferente, debería ser algo changeless, o sea, que no cambia. Correcto. Esas van a ser las cosas que después del pasaje de la noesis noesios va a considerar Aristóteles como las razones o las causas por las cuales mm, participa de lo bueno o posee lo bueno, posee lo perfecto, el intelecto divino. Y esas son características coincidentes. En fin, yo creo que es esa creo que es esa, no encuentro una mejor, no he encontrado, pero tengo que ver, digamos, reinspeccionar comentarios y esas cosas. Es mi idea sobre eso, Javier.
Estoy seguro que debe haber más preguntas, pero podemos continuar en el coffee break. Muchas gracias, Fabián, y gracias a todos.
Muy amable.
Gracias por la moderación. Vamos a por la moderación.
No es obviamente algo que cambie, es la misma cosa, distintas visiones, ¿no? De algo que nos lleva a Kínesis.
Yo creo que hay gente, por ejemplo, por ejemplo, que está en producción que tiene acá, y dice, bueno, esto es la Jackson tampoco.
Sí.
Todos tenemos muchas dudas acerca de qué objeto le vamos a aplicar al pensamiento si pensamos que piensa en algo, ¿no? No piensa actualmente en sí mismo. Y parece que se puede estar en salvación. Una ciencia, parece que eso va muy bien. Jackson dice que piensa todas las formas de la accidente.
Y se recuerda esa idea, sí.